Hello, this is Dan O'Brien. I'm an extension agricultural economist at Kansas State University. I'd like to speak a little bit about grain sorghum prices and costs during the time frame here when so many things are affected by the coronavirus and with the volatility we're seeing both good and bad in the markets. We're going to take a look today at Kansas grain sorghum prices and costs. Some good news has been happening in the last few days, literally, for grain sorghum. We've seen some export movement begin to occur. U.S. grain sorghum exports have been really kind of up and down. You'll have some weeks of 4, 5, 6, 7 million bushels, and then some weeks of 1 or 2 or 3. But that's really kind of the mode. If you watch the flow of grain sorghum exports, we kind of bunch them up apparently, rather than just a consistent run through. China said to be adjusting some of its corn supports again to encourage more production through all the gyrations they've had. That, if I understand things right, they're short again for they're adjusting their supports, trying to encourage more production, and of course that tied in with phase one issues, phase one trade agreement issues between the U.S. and China. All those things have worked together to now we've seen some movement on the grains. Forward purchases of grain sorghum, not so much shipments, but forward purchases jumped about 20 million bushels over the last 1 or 2 weeks. So that's no small thing, especially when the total projected for the U.S. is 135. So to jump 20 million bushels in 1 week is really an underlying positive thing. And we see it in the basis levels at Kansas terminal elevators, particularly in the central and eastern part of the state. They've jumped, and for some of those key locations, 10, 15 cents, some of them. Again, somebody in Kansas, when we see bids jump, somebody's got to train their filling. That's kind of the way I view that intuitively. So this is a good time for Kansas grain sorghum to distinguish itself from the broader feed grain complex. Overall, we're seeing struggles with the ethanol industry. Of course, grain sorghum goes into these same plants, particularly in Kansas, but to the degree that grain sorghum can distinguish itself from corn, basically, it will be perhaps a little bit more protected in this feed grain downturn that it seems like we're seeing now, following on the heels of problems in the ethanol industry. When you look at different trends going on in the market, you can see something really interesting. You see now that at those terminal elevators in eastern and central Kansas, particularly USDA numbers out of Atchison and some elsewhere, now the cash price for grain sorghum has jumped markedly above that of the futures. Now, country elevators, they've come up some too, but really they're kind of in a little bit narrower relationship, a little bit narrower basis than they were, but you really see the difference at the export-oriented terminals. And again, where we had fallen to in the midst of the coronavirus worries was down basically to where we had been, again, about 275, 276 per bushel, where we found ourselves in eastern Kansas anyway, back in last year, 2019. When you look at where we're at relative to price, relative to costs, for all in eastern and central Kansas, for all but the more distant elevators, we're above cost production. Even those have come back to where they're almost giving a bid of 320 that covers full costs. And of course, for some of those now, they're at 420. This is a north central non-irrigated bid for about 100 bushel an acre. And you come in and look at what's happening in the western part of the state. You've got southwest Kansas, 85 bushel per acre non-irrigated. The bids now have come up there as well. We're covering now all of direct costs and of 307 per acre for dry land for those better bids at the terminals. And probably if exports get going, it'd be really interesting to see in the next several weeks if grain sorghum exports in Kansas continue and we have this demand strength, if even in the West, we start to see prices move from 320 or so up towards 350, 360, 372 is total cost break even for 85 bushel non-irrigated grain sorghum. So we shall see. And but there's hope that for grain sorghum now, with the reintroduction of export business that there probably wasn't just 1 or 2 or 3 weeks ago. Thank you very much. This is Dan O'Brien, Kent State University Extension.